Nestled in the shadow of the verdant hills, the village of Eldmark lay where time itself seemed to stand still. Ancient oak trees lined the cobblestone streets, and the chirping of birds at dawn filled the air with song. The villagers lived simple lives, a life spent tilling the fertile soil, tending their livestock, and stories by the fire. But beneath the calm facade, rumors of an impending storm had started spreading, a storm that would soon change the fate of a young woman named Aviva. Aviva was unlike anyone in Eldmark. At 18, her piercing emerald eyes seemed to see far beyond the present, as though they carried the weight of unseen futures. Her dark auburn hair, often tied into a loose braid, framed a face both determined and kind. Aviva lived in a modest cottage with her widowed mother Leora and her younger brother Cale. The family had struggled ever since Aviva's father died during the Great Harvest Famine years ago, but she carried their burdens with a quiet resilience that inspired those around her. As the sun rose over Eldmark on a crisp autumn morning, Aviva stood at the edge of the fields, her hands calloused from years of labor. The cool breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it an unusual sense of urgency. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had been gnawing at her for days. "Aviva!" Kyle's voice rang through the quiet air. The boy ran down the hill, his cheeks flushed pink with excitement. "You won't believe it. The king's herald is in the square." Aviva smoothed her apron over her front and raised an eyebrow. "A herald? What could the king want in Eldmark? We're nothing but a forgotten village." Cale shrugged, his grin growing. "Come and see for yourself." It was a short walk to the village square, but by now it was already crowded. There, standing with haughty airs and with his royal insignia embroidered across the chest of his crimson cloak, stood the man they were waiting for. His booming voice echoed above the murmurs of the villagers. "By order of King Arendor of Finora," declared the herald, "all men and women who are able to bear arms must make themselves ready for battle. Our kingdom is being threatened by the northern kingdoms of Drakkara. Their legions march southward, intending to take our lands and make our people their slaves." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Aviva felt her stomach knot. War. Eldmark had always been a peaceful haven, far removed from the political intrigues of the capital. The herald continued, "The king calls upon the courage of his people. Soldiers will be recruited from every village. Those who serve valiantly will be rewarded with land and honor." Aviva glanced over at Kyle, who had grown quiet and frightened by now. She placed a soothing hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry," she whispered. "They won't take you. You're too young." But her heart was heavy with uncertainty. Eldmark had no warriors, no training for battle. The idea of her neighbors being shipped out to fight seasoned soldiers was inconceivable. As the crowd began to disperse, Aviva stayed behind in the square, her mind racing. She could not help but feel that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she could understand. As the villagers gathered in the community hall to ponder over the king's decree, that evening, Aviva slipped away into the forest. She often found solace in the woods where rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl calm her restless mind. Tonight, however, the forest was different, alive in a way she had never experienced. It was alive, as if the wind carried whispers, faint and indistinct but unmistakably there. "Aviva." She froze. The voice was soft, almost breezy, yet it carried some weight. "Who's here?" she cried, her voice shaking. Shadows parted. An old crone emerged dressed in a silver cloak that resembled moonlight shimmering on water. Her eyes, the milky color of aged cow's milk, could see right through Aviva, as if looking beyond the physical facade. "You are one," the old woman said. Her voice was soothing yet commanding, like a song sung to quiet the storm. "The one for what?" Aviva inquired, drawing back cautiously. The woman's smile was weak. The one who shall bring light to Fenora in its darkest hour. First, though, you must discover the courage inside of you. Your road shall be treacherous, and the choices you make will mold the fate of many. Aviva shook her head, her heart pounding. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. I'm just a farmer's daughter. The woman reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, intricately carved pendant. It gleamed in the moonlight, its surface etched with ancient symbols. Take this, she said, holding it out to Aviva. It will guide you when the time comes. Aviva hesitated for a moment before taking the pendant. The moment she put it into her palm, she started to feel a strange warmth running through her. Who are you? She asked her, and her voice was barely above a whisper. The woman smiled at her once more. Her form became indistinct, like mist in the morning sun. I am but a messenger. The rest is up to you, Aviva, she declared, then disappeared with the wind. When Aviva returned home, the pendant still clutched in her hand, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The king's decree had set into motion a chain of events that would forever alter her life. The mysterious woman's words would continue to haunt her mind. The choices you make will shape the fate of many. As the sun rises over Eldmark, Aviva stands at her window, staring out at the horizon. The peaceful village she had always known was on the brink of chaos. But deep within her, a spark of determination began to burn. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She would not stand by and watch her world crumble. The days that passed after the decree of the king were a haze of uncertainty. Villagers in Eldmark worked feverishly, preparing the supplies for soldiers who would march to war in the near future. However, beneath this undercurrent of fear was something palpable. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, families huddled together and whispered prayers to the gods of old. Aviva felt restless, though. The pendant was heavy around her neck, something the mysterious woman had given to her. There was comfort to it, a foreboding sense of threat. She didn't know exactly how her life was tied into that of the kingdom, but the feeling persisted, like a subtle undertow pulling at her. One evening, at the last assembly before the arrival of the king's soldiers, Aviva stood at the far end of the hall, arms crossed tightly across her chest. The village elder, a stooping man named Erend, spoke to the crowd in a voice heavy with sorrow. "We are a peaceful folk," he started. "We have never known the life of war. But the king has summoned us, and we will go. And for those of you who will stay, pray for those of us who go. And for those of you who go, carry the hope of Eldmark in your hearts." The crowd agreed, but in their voices was the taste of resignation. Aviva stepped forward, her voice ringing clear and firm. "Elder Erend, what hope can we offer if we march to our deaths unprepared? Should we not demand more from the king? Training, weapons, a strategy?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Aviva, a mere farmer's daughter who dared to question the king's decree. "Bold words for one so young," Erend said, his voice both surprised and guarded. "But what do you suggest, Aviva?" "The king's decree is law." Aviva's heartbeat was pounding in her chest. She could have sworn the pendant around her neck pulsed with warmth, as if it urged her on. "If we're going to fight, we'll need to be ready. We can't count on only the king's men. Eldmark's people are resourceful and strong. We can learn to train, make preparations for defenses, and defend what is ours." A murmur of assent passed through the crowd. Many nodded, their spirits buoyed by her words. She looked him over for a moment before shaking her head and sighing. "Very well. If you are willing to lead this effort, Aviva, the village will follow. But know this, the path you propose is fraught with danger. Are you ready to bear the burden?" Aviva stood a little straighter, her voice steady. "I am." And so, the following morning, Aviva rallied the villagers in the central square. Under Aaron's reluctant blessing, groups were set up to start training with makeshift arms, wooden staffs, hunting bows, and farm tools remade into crude instruments of war. Kyle looked on from the side, his eyes wide with admiration. "You really are doing it, Aviva," he said as she demonstrated a simple defensive stance to a group of young men. "I don't have a choice," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "If we're going to survive, we need to fight like our lives depend on it, because they do." Over the next week, the square transformed into a bustling training ground. Villagers practiced archery, sparred with wooden swords, and constructed barriers from fallen logs and stones. Despite their inexperience, their determination grew with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set below the horizon, Aviva sat by the fire, her muscles aching from the day's work. She turned the pendant over in her hand, tracing the intricate symbols etched into its surface. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. The pendant seemed to shimmer in response, a faint glow emanating from its center. "You seek answers." The voice made her jump, and she raised her eyes to see the elderly woman standing there again in front of her from the forest. How did you—" Aviva stuttered, but the woman pressed a finger on her lips for silence. "There is no time for questions, child," said the woman urgently. "The enemy marches faster than you think. Finora's survival is in your hands. But I'm just one person," Aviva protested. "How can I possibly make a difference?" The woman moved closer, her milky eyes fixed on Aviva's. "You are not just one person. You are the bearer of the Flameheart, a gift passed down through generations. It is a power born of courage, and it will awaken when you need it most. But beware. Courage without wisdom is folly. Choose your path carefully." Before Aviva had an opportunity to retort, the woman disappeared, leaving only the faint hint of wildflowers trailing in her wake. The following morning, a scout rode into Eldmark, his horse foaming at the mouth with exhaustion. He dismounted hastily and approached Aaron, his face pale with fear. "The northern armies have crossed the Frostfang River," he said, his voice trembling. "They'll be here within a fortnight." The gasps were loud and clear. Aviva stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "How many?" "Thousands," the scout replied, "and they are ruthless. They burn every village they pass." Panic had spread like wildfire, but Aviva raised her hand, commanding silence. "We don't have time to despair. We have trained for this. We'll fortify Eldmark and make our stand here. Together we can hold them off." Her words were met with a mixture of fear and determination. The villagers scrambled to fortify the town, building barricades and sharpening weapons. As night fell, Aviva stood on the hill overlooking Eldmark, the pendant glowing faintly against her chest. She clenched her fists, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. "I'll protect them," she whispered to the wind. "No matter what it takes." Unbeknownst to her, a shadow watched from the tree line, its eyes gleaming with malice. The storm was closer than she realized, and the choices she would make in the coming days would shape the fate of not just Eldmark, but the entire kingdom of Finora. Ash-scented, despair-laden northern winds shrieked down the fortified streets of Eldmark. The villagers stood behind makeshift barricades with their breath steaming in the icy air, mothers clutching their children, fathers holding up weapons with their hands shaking, and fear wrapped tight around their hearts. Yet against all this, Aviva stands, her eyes flashing green with an air of determination. Aaron came up to her, his voice low and urgent. "The scouts report that the enemy is just beyond the hills. By dawn, they'll be upon us." Aviva nodded, her mind racing. The villagers had prepared as best they could, but their crude defenses and lack of experience left them vulnerable. She clutched the pendant around her neck, its warmth a steady reminder of the mysterious woman's words. "You are the bearer of the Flameheart." She didn't fully understand what that meant, but she knew one thing for certain. She could not fail these people. As the first rays of dawn broke through the mist, the enemy appeared on the horizon. Hundreds of soldiers clad in black armor marched in unison, their banners bearing the sigil of Drakara, a crimson serpent coiled around a broken crown. The villagers stood firm. Their makeshift swords and spears shone feebly against the pale daylight. Aviva stepped forward with her voice now steady and true. "Today we're fighting not for our homes anymore, but our future," she shouted. "They may hold numbers and steel, but there's something even greater than both of those for us. It's our fearlessness and oneness. Be strong together, and we will come out victorious." The enemy charged with a battle cry, which carried over the hills. Arrows darkened the sky, but the villagers stood and raised their shields to deflect most of the onslaught. Chaos erupted when the soldiers reached the barricades. Aviva fought with a ferocity that belied her years, her wooden staff moving with precision and power. She knocked a soldier off balance, disarming him with a swift strike before turning to help an elderly farmer who had been cornered. "Hold the line!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the din of battle. Despite their bravery, the villagers started to give in. The sheer number of the enemy overwhelmed them, and the barricades were starting to crumble. Aviva's heart sank as she realized they couldn't hold out much longer. As the enemy pressed forward, Aviva felt the pendant around her neck grow unbearably hot. A blinding light erupted from its center, forcing everyone, friend and foe alike, to shield their eyes. As the light fades, Aviva stands in the center of the battlefield, golden aura around her. Symbols on her pendant glow very intensely now. Her staff is an intense blade. The edges blaze with flame. Awestruck villagers stared ahead as their once moribund spirits re-emerged to welcome the new, revamped leader. "Not on our property!" Aviva yelled out with raw power. She charged into the fray, her blade slicing through enemy ranks with ease. The flames seemed to dance in harmony with her movements, creating a barrier that the enemy could not penetrate. The villagers rallied behind her, their courage renewed. The battle raged on, but with Aviva leading the charge, the tide began to turn. The enemy's ranks wavered, their confidence shaken by the sight of the young woman wielding such immense power. Just as victory seemed within reach, a booming voice echoed across the battlefield. "Enough!" A huge figure stepped out of the enemy lines, clad in blackened steel and brandishing a jagged sword. His crimson cloak billowed in the wind, and his eyes burned with malice. This was General Kaelor, the ruthless commander of Drakara's forces. "You think a mere girl can stop me?" he sneered, pointing his blade at Aviva. The battlefield fell silent as the two faced each other. Aviva tightened her grip on her flaming blade, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not just a girl," she said, her voice steady. "I am the Flameheart, and I will protect my people." Kaelor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that." He and Kaelor clashed in a storm of sparks and steel. Kaelor's strikes were fierce, but Aviva now had strength and agility enough to sidestep his attacks. The battlefield became their playground, the villagers and other enemy soldiers being attentive spectators to their duel in speechless tension. As their duel went on, Kaelor started to weaken. Aviva's blade was glowing with a brightness that seemed to be draining him of his energy. With one final, decisive blow, she disarmed him, her blade poised at his throat. "Yield," she demanded, her voice ringing with authority. Kaelor glared at her, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, he dropped to his knees, signaling his surrender. Enemy forces, without any leadership and full of demoralization, retreat toward the north. A cheer emerged from the people at the village. They embraced, their tears pouring out because they have finally seen light. Aviva stood at the field where a fight occurred, seeing the fires near her blade lose flame because of how dimmed the pendant was getting. She had waves of fatigue over her body, but this time with such satisfaction. Aaron stepped forward, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us, Aviva. Fenora owes you a debt it can never repay." Aviva shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. It was the courage of Eldmark's people that won this day." The villagers gathered around her, their faces alight with admiration. For the first time in her life, Aviva felt truly at home, not just in Eldmark, but in the role she had been destined to fulfill. In the weeks that followed, word of Eldmark's victory swept across Fenora. The king himself journeyed to the village to honor Aviva and her people, declaring her the guardian of the Flameheart. But Aviva knew that this journey was far from over. The Flameheart was a gift, but also a responsibility. And so, she stood there in her mind as the mysterious woman had spoken. Courage without wisdom is folly. And she vowed on that hill overlooking Eldmark, pendant glowing faintly against her chest, to use her power wisely and protect those who could not protect themselves. First-time hope in the generations for Fenora. And it started out with a youth who stood brave when others became weak. To the winds whispering in the Eldmark forest, carrying afar and wide it went, her name, Aviva, Flameheart,